everybody. Welcome to our Northwest Author Series for March. Today we are going to hear from Greg Nokes, and we will have a question and answer session after the talk. So be sure to raise your hand if you want to participate in that, and then unmute yourself when you want to ask a question. We want to remind you that this is being sponsored by the Northwest Author Series. We have authors every month. Next month, we will have J.A. Jantz, who is quite a popular mystery writer. So be sure and stay tuned for more information about her. But today we are going to listen to our Gregory Nokes, or Greg, as I knew him when we both worked at the Oregonian. Greg spent 40 years as a journalist for Associated Press and the Oregonian. He was an AP foreign correspondent in Latin America and an AP correspondent in Washington, D.C. Today, Greg will demonstrate his other interest, Oregon history. It's little remembered that slavery was the dominant issue for delegates attending the Oregon's Constitutional Convention in 1857. But the debate started much earlier than that, when wagon trains began to bring white settlers to Oregon, a few of whom came with slaves. Greg today will discuss the two books that he has written on Oregon slavery, Breaking Chains, Slavery on Trial in the Oregon Territory, and The Troubled Life of Peter Burnett, Oregon pioneer and first governor of California. Greg will also preview a book coming out this year, Eminent Oregonians, which includes a section on Jesse Applegate, who, as a delegate to Oregon's Constitutional Convention, carried the argument against slavery. So please help me welcome Greg Nokes. Take it away, Greg.
Hey, thank you, Nancy. It's a pleasure to be part of the Northwest Authors Series, and good to see everybody out there virtually anyway. And I'm glad to be here. And before I do anything else, I just want to mention that if my books interest anybody here and you want to buy one of them, I think the Cannon Beach bookstore there has plenty on hand, or can at least get them anyway. I'm going to split the screen here and show a few slides at the start. I can figure out how to do this. All right, here we go. Okay. These are my grandparents, Minnie and Will Junkin. You might think it an odd way to start out a presentation on Oregon slavery, but they play a major role in the book that I did. Minnie on the left her ancestors came out on the Oregon Trail in 1853, and she had a particular interest in the history of the Oregon Trail and the early settlement of Oregon. Her husband, Will, is on the right. He was an electrician who helped install many of the electrical wires around Oregon in those days. And while professionally they were not enormously successful, they had a great interest in genealogy. And so both of them were graduates of Oregon State College, which at the time was Oregon Agricultural College, now Oregon State University, and at a time when not a lot of people were graduating from those schools. So they're both well educated, and they had a lifelong interest in genealogy of their family. They made possible this book on Oregon slavery, Breaking Chains, which came out in 2009. And it was their research that played into my ability to do this, book. They wrote something called the Henkel Genealogy, which is 1,500 pages. Now, it's not something I normally would have read, but my brother Bill, who knew of my interest in writing books, said, "Why don't you write about Reuben Shipley?" And I said, "Who was Reuben Shipley?" He said, "He was a slave brought to Oregon by one of our ancestors." And I said, "Well, I had no idea there was any involvement in the family in slavery. So this was a revelation to me, nor did I know that there were ever slaves in Oregon." Another revelation. So this was obviously a direction that interested me. So how do I find out about this story, Bill? Well, look in the Henkel Genealogy on page 359. Well, I had a copy of the genealogy, which came out in 1964, and never would have bothered to read it except for what my brother Bill told me. So I went to page 359, and there was this revelation. And I'll read just a bit here off the top. Robert Shipley of Missouri crossed the plains to Oregon in 1853. He was accompanied by his first wife and probably 7 children. He also brought a slave known as Uncle Reuben Shipley, who's buried in the Mount Union Cemetery near Corvallis, Oregon, as R.E. Ficklin. His owner promised him his freedom if he would come to Oregon and help him get settled. This promise or agreement was fulfilled, and the slave, known as Uncle Reuben Shipley, settled also in Benton County. He is buried in Mount Union Cemetery, 4 miles west of Corvallis, probably under his true name, R.E. Ficklin, together with his own family. Uncle Reuben gave the original tract of land for Mount Union Cemetery. This cemetery is often called the Newton Cemetery for G.G. Newton, who lived nearby and was a sexton for many years. Uncle Reuben's wife was also a former slave of another settler, and he was required to purchase her freedom. Well, this was quite a revelation to me, so I pursued that story. And this is a Mount Union Cemetery where where Reuben Shipley and his wife are buried, and many members of their family, and also members of my family, those who came out on the Oregon Trail. Many of them settled in the Philomath area in Benton County and are buried here. And the daughters, you can see the plaque in the lower left-hand corner there, which gives a little bit of the history of the museum, of the cemetery. The Daughters of the American Revolution recently won approval for wording of a new plaque, which is going to go up on that stone, which gives more of the history of the cemetery. So the first slaves came out with the leader of the Great Migration, Peter Hardeman Burnett, who was born in Tennessee. He was fought in the Mormon Wars. He was elected captain of the first major wagon train known as the Great Migration, which brought out about 1,000 white settlers, more than doubling the existing white population in Oregon at the time. That was in 1843. Burnett brought at least 2 slaves that we know about, one who drowned in the Columbia River on the way out. He was elected to the 1844 Legislative Council and eventually went on to be the first governor of California. Burnett was responsible for the first of Oregon's exclusion laws. It's little known that during almost all of Oregon's early history, there were exclusion laws in effect which banned African Americans from coming to Oregon or settling in Oregon in that period. Now, Burnett allowed the early settlers to bring some slaves with a stipulation that they would have to leave within 2 or 3 years, 2 years, or 3 years for a male anyway. And if they did not leave in that period, they would be subjected to severe lashing. And you can see the number is a maximum of 39 lashes would be applied. And you say, why 39? Because in Europe, the Spaniards or somebody had determined that a person could survive 39 lashes, but probably not any more than that. So that was that odd number that was put there. We don't know if anybody was actually lashed in that period, and that law was quickly changed the following year. This is Nathaniel Ford. Burnett brought out a couple of slaves, as I said. There was another slave, at least 3 slaves came out on that first wagon train. There weren't many. In fact, I'll stop here and say probably the maximum number of slaves in Oregon could not have exceeded 100 and probably was closer to about 60. Which is not many, considering that the slave census for the United States in 1860 was 4 million. So say Oregon had 100 slaves, it wasn't many, but the fact there were slaves here at all was to me a revelation. The fellow who brought out more slaves than anybody else was Nathaniel Ford, pictured here with his wife, and they brought out 6 slaves. Anyway, Nathaniel Ford was kind of a big deal in Missouri. He'd served in the legislature. He was a county sheriff out there, and he had probably as many as 30 slaves. But the economy went into hard times throughout the nation, and free land was being offered to settlers in Oregon. Most of us know that history. And so Nathaniel Ford organized his own wagon train in 1844, and he brought out 6 slaves, 5 members of the Holmes family, and then a 6th adult slave. And they settled in Oregon near Dallas in Polk County. In my book, I identify about 35 slaves in this early period of Oregon history. I've since learned of at least 15 more, but you can see on the left, there's a number of Holmes. The Holmeses were slaves brought out by Nathaniel Ford. The very first slave we know about who was brought to Oregon was Rachel Belden at the top of the list in 1843. And then there was a girl who also came out in that 1843 wagon train, probably by Peter Burnett, and we don't know her name. And in some cases, we have only first names, and we don't know the years they came out. And I acquired these names from different sources, newspaper accounts, people's diaries, like our own family diary, and historical accounts and newspapers that would occasionally carry a name of a slave involved in some situation. So Nathaniel Ford settled on his donation land claim of 360 acres there at present-day Rickreall, Oregon, and virtually that entire town of Rickreall is on land that was once belonged to Nathaniel Ford and his donation land claim, and was farmed by his slaves. Now, many of those who brought slaves in the early period released them fairly soon, and this was the case with a slave brought by our ancestor, but Nathaniel Ford kept his slaves. And so Robin Holmes, who was the head of the Holmes family, had won his freedom by agreeing to go to California and mine gold for Nathaniel Ford, with the understanding that he and his wife Polly would get their freedom on the way back. And when they got back, they indeed got their freedom, but Nathaniel Ford kept their children, saying that, well, I clothed them when they were little and housed them, and now I'm entitled to some of their labor. So Robin Holmes filed suit against Nathaniel Ford. This house is where the Ford family lived, and the slave quarters are in the back in here somewhere. And I found this picture at the Oregon Historical Society. A point to make here is that most of the material that I'm talking about has been available and is known. It's just not been publicized. There have been, fragments in historical societies, newspapers have carried articles, but nobody really has ever brought it together before. And in part was my work from my grandparents, which helped to bring that about. This is Mary Jane Holmes Shipley, and she kind of connects the dots between the Holmes family and the Shipleys, who are my ancestors. This is the only picture we have of anybody in the Holmes family. And I was mentioning that Robin Holmes, the head of the family, filed suit for the freedom of his children. And one of them was Polly Holmes. And this picture was taken shortly before her death. She would eventually marry Reuben Shipley, who was a slave brought up by our ancestor. And as you can see, Ford demanded that in exchange for her hand in marriage, that Reuben Shipley should pay him $800. This photo was taken in 1924, shortly before her death. This is Reuben Boyce. He was not an advocate of slavery, and he represented the Holmes family in their slave trial against Nathaniel Ford. Now, I was astounded. I'd mentioned earlier, I was astounded to know that there were ever slaves in Oregon. I was equally astounded to know there was ever a slave trial in Oregon. That was Holmes versus Ford in 1852 and 1853. And Boyce, who later became an Oregon Supreme Court justice, represented the Holmes family. He was also very active in the legislature in that period. This was Judge George Williams who settled the case. And you can see, get rid of this here, read some of this with you. There was a long trial. I can't figure out how to get rid of this stuff. There we go. Okay. There was a long trial in Holmes versus Ford. 3 different judges before Judge Holmes took up the case, before Judge Williams took up the case, considered the case and refused to decide, probably because they were either pro-slavery or in some cases appointed by presidents such as James Polk, who were themselves president, who were pro-slavery. But Judge Williams came from New York and he had no interest in slavery, and he got the case as head of the Oregon Territorial Supreme Court and decided the case. This was a pivotal ruling that slavery was unlawful in Oregon, and I'll read it with you. On July 19, 1853, ruling in Holmes versus Ford, Williams said, "I so held that without some positive legislative enactment establishing slavery here, it did not and could not exist in Oregon, and I awarded the colored people their freedom. So far as I know, this was the last effort made to hold slaves in Oregon by force of law. There were a great many virulent pro-slavery men in the territory, and the decision, of course, was very distasteful to them." And you notice that last line, a great many virulent pro-slavery men in the territory. This was indeed the case. So Williams did order the children be freed, but that didn't mean that they would be freed because nobody was really enforcing the laws in this period. This is where the Oregon Constitutional Convention was held in 1857, and there was no issue more important or considered more controversial before the legislators in that period, and whether Oregon would be a slave state. As I read this in Oregon history, that blew me away, that was the overriding concern of the convention, whether Oregon would be a slave state. All this stuff has really been forgotten because it was embarrassing to our history to know these things. The head of the convention, Constitutional Convention, was Matthew Deedy, and Matthew Deedy was the very, very pro-slavery. And on the eve of the convention, just a few weeks before it was started, he said, if a citizen of Virginia can lawfully own a Negro, of which there is no doubt, then I, as a citizen of Oregon, can lawfully obtain the same right of property in this Negro by either purchase or inheritance. Deedy, you may recall, established the University of Oregon Law School, and only recently was his name erased from the law school because of activities by the Black Lives Matter movement to remove his name. This is Joseph Lane. He was another active, I'm putting up a few pictures here of people who were very influential in early Oregon, were very pro-slavery in this period. And one of them was Joseph Lane, the first appointed governor of Oregon, who later on became the first US senator from Oregon, and later on became a candidate for president on a slave state ticket. Almost all of these things were total revelations to me. I remember as a school kid hearing that Joseph Lane ran in the 1860 convention as or campaign as a candidate for vice president. And I'm saying, oh, that's important. You know, Oregon had somebody who was running for national office like that, nominated by his party. Had no idea as a little kid that was a slave state ticket. He did not win, obviously. He ran with John Breckinridge, who ran for president. But in part, his candidacy is kind of a third-party candidate. There was a Democratic Party candidate, then there was the Joseph Lane Breckinridge race, and then there was Lincoln. And he helped to get Lincoln elected. But you can see a statement that he made about the time of the Oregon Convention. We have under the Constitution as much right to hold our property, slaves, and have them protected as we have to hold our cattle and have them protected. This is Lafayette Grover. He was a member of the legislature and a governor and also a delegate to the convention. And you can see what he said on the eve of the convention. I am one of those who believes that the government of the United States is a government of white men, that the Declaration of Independence was a declaration of the equality and natural free citizenship of white men. How bizarre. After the Civil War was over and the various amendments were passed that prevented equal rights to African American men, although not women at the time, he refused to allow the 15th Amendment granting of voting rights to African Americans to even come before the legislature, feeling that that was just totally out of line. And the 15th Amendment, again, embarrassing to Oregon, was not actually approved in Oregon until 1959, if you can believe it, done very quietly. These were the, this was the Free State letter. Judge George Williams, who had decided the Holmes versus Ford case favoring the former slaves of Holmes, also was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention against slavery. And in July 1857, very shortly before the convention opened, he wrote an open letter to the Salem newspaper at the time, the Statesman, that ran on page 1. And this was a time, according to historians, when pro-slavery sentiment was really very active and nobody knew how the convention was going to come out. I don't know how to get rid of these darn pictures. Put them down here. So this was in his letter. It was a long, long letter and had a lot of racist language in it. So it's not hasn't been very well publicized in history, but it was pivotal at the time. I know what siren song self-love sings for slavery. How pleasant it seems in prospect to have a slave to till our ground, to wait upon us while we wake and fan us when we sleep. But establish slavery here and the effect will be as it has elsewhere. You will turn aside that tide of free white labor, which has poured itself like a fertilizing flood across the great states of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and is now murmuring up the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains. So his opposition to slavery was on economic grounds, that if African Americans were allowed to come out here and slavery was approved, they would take jobs from whites. And that's how he argued. And at the time, it turned out to be fairly persuasive. This was the commentary at the time written by historian Walter Carlton Woodward about this statement by Williams. As pro-slavery sentiment had by this time been steadily rising from the publication of the Free State letter to the election in November, it seemed steadily to recede. So the issue was really decided on economic grounds rather than humanitarian grounds, although there were indeed people who opposed slavery on humanitarian grounds. One of those who was pivotal in arguing against slavery at the convention was Jesse Applegate, who was one of the captains of the 1843 wagon train. Jesse considered himself an ugly man and allowed no pictures of himself. I'm now doing a book on Jesse, which should be out later this year. It'll be part of a book called Eminent Oregonians. But you can see what his statement was here. You can see what the statement that Jesse had made. The discussion of the subject of slavery by this body is out of place and uncalled for and only calculated to engender bitter feelings among the members of the body, destroy its harmony, retard its business, and unnecessarily prolong its session. These were some of the comments made by different delegates. In the book, I have a long section on the debate on the Constitutional Convention, but here's a sampling of it. Thomas Dreyer, Multnomah County. The people sent us up here to discuss the question and submit it to them for a decision. The question of slavery is the all-important question in Oregon now. Delazon Smith, Lynn County. Hundreds in the country were for a free state if free Negroes were kept out of the state. But if we were to have Negroes at all, let them be slaves. Erasmus Shattuck, Washington County. It should be known to our children whether they live under a free or slave state constitution. I go for a free state, and I wish that to be understood. A.J. Lovejoy, Clackamas County. You can't keep this Negro question out. It will come up in some shape, and the convention has got to meet it. Look, what the convention did was kind of kick the can down the road. They couldn't decide. The debate was acrimonious. Jesse Applegate ended up walking out of the convention because it wouldn't take a stand, and they kicked the can down the road and submitted the issue to voters. And against the background of this Free State letter I was mentioning a moment ago, which had kind of turned things around from pro-slavery sentiment, you can see what the vote for slavery was. For slavery, 2,645. Against slavery, 7,727. But there was a companion clause in the convention that banned free Negroes from coming to Oregon. For exclusion, 8,640 against 1,081. This was a third exclusion clause in Oregon's history in this period, and this was not removed from the Constitution until 1926, long after it had effect, of course, because the amendments after the Civil War had decided the issue on whether Blacks could move freely around the country. But the fact that it stayed in Oregon Constitution until 1926 was amazing and discouraging to me. And this is how the Constitution read. No free Negro, didn't mention slaves, no free Negro or mulatto not resident in this state at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall come, reside, or be within this state, or hold any real estate, or make any contracts, or maintain any suit therein. And the legislative assembly shall provide by penal laws for the removal by public officers of all such Negroes and mulattoes, and for their effectual exclusion from the state, and for the punishment of persons who shall bring them into the state, or employ or harbor them. And there were instances of Blacks living in Oregon who were forced to leave the state because of this clause. As I mentioned, there were people who opposed slavery on humanitarian grounds, and one was Obed Dickinson on the right. He was the head of the Salem Congregational Church, which integrated with former slaves in 1861, yes, I got that year right, including the Shipley family now, who are now freed because of the Holmes ruling. And they were freed and they were allowed to join the church. And the white members of the congregation were so incensed that they forced Obed Dickinson out as the minister of the church, and he ended up opening a garden store, a seed store there in Salem. He was talking about the sermons. He was, among other things, he presided over the wedding of two Blacks, former slaves, and that was very controversial. He admitted former slaves, 3 of them, into the church, including the Shipley, or the Holmes family, excuse me, not the Shipley, it's the Holmes family, who had been freed by that slave ruling. And he was subject to a lot of controversy. He was very upset about the racism, the fact that there were no schools for Blacks in Oregon at the time. This is just a brief comment that he made complaining to the church leadership back east. In that sermon, I said there is a wrong public opinion in this town. It has closed the doors of all our schools against the children of these Black families, dooming them to ignorance in life. I said it was wrong to take away the key of knowledge from any human being, especially wrong when their property was taxed to support our schools, not to let them have some privileges in the schools. A brother came to me the next day and said, that sermon will take away $500 from our church building. And as I said, he was eventually forced out of the church. But all that now is a proud part of this church's history. And Obed Dickinson was one of the few in Oregon who spoke out against slavery and mistreatment of Blacks on on humanitarian grounds. This is Amanda Johnson. And she was, pictures here of a few of the early slaves brought to Oregon. Now, the pictures we have are of African Americans, Blacks who had achieved some fame, who had done well, because to have your picture taken, you had to have achieved some status in that period. So we don't have many pictures of slaves who didn't do well, but Amanda Johnson did. But this is her history. Before she came to Oregon, when she came to Oregon, she was a slave in Missouri, and she was given the option of coming to Oregon or not coming to Oregon. I want to give credit now to somebody who'd explored this story before me, a fellow named Fred Lockley, who used to be a reporter for the Oregon Journal. And he interviewed back in the 1920s, he interviewed some of the former slaves while they were still alive. And so this account really comes from Fred Lockley's work, who's received very little attention. Amanda Johnson was born at Liberty, Clay County, Missouri on August 30, 1833, and arrived in Oregon in 1853 with the Anderson Deckard family. In an interview from her home in Albany in 1921, Johnson told journalist Fred Lockley that although a slave, she was proud she had never been bought or sold, wrote Lockley, and I'm quoting from his article. When I asked her if she had ever been sold as a slave, she said, "No, sir, I was never sold nor bartered for. I was given as a wedding present to my owner's daughter. I belonged to Mrs. Nancy Wilhite. Mrs. Wilhite later married Mr. Coram. When her daughter, Miss Lydia, was married, she gave me to her as a wedding present. I have known 7 generations of the family. I had 5 brothers and 6 sisters. None of us were ever sold like common Negroes. We were all given away as the different young folks got married." So she was proud to have been a wedding present. How sad. In 1853, my owners came to Oregon. A man offered my master $1,200 for me. I was 19 years old then. My owners said, "Amanda isn't for sale. She is going across the plains to the Willamette Valley with us. She is like one of the family. I don't care to sell her." It took us 6 months to come from Liberty, Missouri to Oregon City. We reached our destination on September 13, 1853. Lou Southworth, also a slave, crossed the plains the same year I did. So did Benjamin Johnson, another slave who later became my husband. Amanda Johnson said Deckard offered to free her if she wanted to stay in Missouri, but as she explained to Lockley, she was afraid. The word of a Negro, even if a free Negro, was of no value in court. Any bad white man could claim I had been stolen from him and could swear me into jail. Then, in place of keeping me in jail, he could buy my services for the time I was sentenced for and do whatever he wanted to me. For Negroes were the same as cows and horses and were not supposed to have morals or souls. I was afraid to accept my liberty, so I came to Oregon with my owners. She died in 1927 at age 94. And this is another former slave. On the third one from the right is America Waldo. Waldo came out in 1943 with Daniel Waldo, or his brother Waldo, and she was treated well as a former slave and ended up marrying Richard Bogle, who was third from the left. And Richard Bogle was a free African American who had come from Jamaica, never a slave, and they got married and lived in Walla Walla. But I mentioned Obed Dickinson got in trouble for marrying a Black couple, and this was the couple that he married. They went on to live fairly prominently in Walla Walla at the time. And this is Lou Southworth, and he was the fellow who also came out in the 1853 wagon train. And Lou Southworth had the unique position of having to buy his own freedom when he came out here. He was illiterate, but he wanted to work hard. He had to raise over $1,000, and he did that by playing fiddles at dances for white folks. And he became a blacksmith, became self-taught, taught himself to read and write, eventually saved enough money to buy his freedom from his white owner, and went down to the coast where he operated a ferry down in the Depot Bay area. But another case where we do have a photograph for someone, a black former slave, who did quite well. But like I say, most of the former slaves did not do so well, and there's little known about them in history. Peter Burnett, who I'd mentioned earlier, the leader of the first major wagon train out to Oregon, was pro-slavery throughout most of his life. He brought, as I mentioned earlier, a couple of slaves out to Oregon, one of whom died on the way. He was born in Tennessee and married into a prominent slave-owning family. And he was a self-taught attorney, pretty bright guy, but made some really bright intelligently, but made some stupid decisions practically. So he became pretty unpopular in Oregon and eventually went on to California, where he got himself elected governor, but he got himself in a lot of trouble because in his first address to the California legislature, he argued for approving slavery in California, and the legislature turned him down. And he served until the second legislature argued the same thing, that California needed to have a ban on slavery. And again, he was rejected, and he was actually ridiculed for that and a number of things and was forced to resign. But he does have his portrait prominently in the California State Capitol in Sacramento, where I found it, and does go down in history as the first elected governor of California. So that's the end of that particular book. I'll be happy to answer questions in a minute, but Nancy wanted me to mention this other book coming out later this year. It's being published by Steve Forrester, who is a publisher of the East Oregonian newspapers, including the Daily Astorian and some others. And I'm one of 4 authors who was asked to write about somebody I wanted to write about. So I wrote about Jesse Applegate and his role as both in opposing slavery in Oregon and developing the Applegate Trail. And you can see others here: Abigail Scott Dunaway, Jane Kirkpatrick, who many of you know, is doing that section. Steve Forrester is doing a section on the first senator, Richard Newberger. Roberta Connor, a Nez Perce in northeastern Oregon, is writing about her ancestor known as Chief Joseph. And so that book will be out and should be interesting. And this is a book I wrote on Peter Burnett's life. I mentioned him, of course, as the first governor of California and the head of Oregon's legislative council, very pro-slavery. And so my son Destin, who was watching in the audience today, I know helped me a lot with this when we went to California to do research on Burnett's life. And this was my first book, which some of you probably know about, Massacred for Gold, The Chinese in Hell's Canyon. Probably been the best selling of all of my books, and very proud of it. So anyway, thank you very much to everyone for being here. I've taken up a lot of time, but I've hoped to have left some time for questions here. So thank you, Nancy. Take it away.
All right, thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? Well, I have one question for you, Greg. You said you were shocked to find out that a member of your family was a slaveholder, but how did you feel? I mean, how did you actually feel about it?
Well, let's see. I've been around a lot as a journalist, so nothing surprises me too much. But I've always taken pride in the fact that members of the family here have been my family have been very much opposed to slavery and pro-integration. And so the fact that in the family there was a history of slavery, it became a piece of history that I was disgusted to know about. I'd rather not know about it. I had different perceptions of the family. And this was a distant relative, not somebody who was who I ever felt close to in my branch of the family. Nevertheless, in addition to being a little bit disgusted, it really was a spark that sent me off on this journey to find out about slavery in Oregon. And the fact that my grandparents disclosed his role in family history was very important in this period. So,
Did you run
So-
across in your interviews with people, did you run across other people such as yourself who either learned that they had slaveholders or recognized that they had slaveholders? Did you talk to anybody like that?
yes, quite a few, as a matter of fact, and I've taken some names. And so when I had, I think in the back of my book, when I wrote the book, there were like 35 names. I think I have that figure of known slaves that I knew about because of people who come up at book events and said, there was a slave in my family background too, or my family were slaveholders at some period. I can add at least 20 additional names to that number. So that's common that people will come up and say, yes, that has happened in our family's history too.
And what do they say about it? Do they talk about their feelings about it, or do they just make a comment that
It's
they
just
had somebody?
like what can they say about it other than it's something that happened. So I'd say it's kind of matter of fact. Nobody likes the fact that it's in their family history, but they just accept it as family history. And of course, if we really do focus on what was going on at the time in our country nationally, it's not that surprising. So when you put it in context, there's nothing startling about it because so many people did have connection to slavery in that period.
Yeah, yeah. Julianne.
This isn't germane to Oregon, but it's germane to ancestors who had slavery. I was surprised to learn by reading a will of a fifth great grandfather, I think, in Pennsylvania, who died about 1760, that he had slaves. And it bothered me a lot. And we hear talk about reparations, and I know that my family did very well. And so I also know that it did very well on the backs of slaves, free labor. So I have sort of started a campaign among people I know who have had slave owners in their history, that we give something, it can be small, annually to any organization in the United States that supports Black people. Could be Southern Law Poverty Conference, it can be a food bank, it can be a scholarship program, anything. And I think that, you know, if we're appalled, as many of us are, and don't know what to do, that's something that we could do. Every year, make an annual check. It can be $25, it can be $150, it could be more if you have more, to some organization that ensures the betterment of the life of some Black people alive today who were not able to build wealth among the generations, the descending generations in their family, the way our families were. So I just wanted to make a comment.
Julianne, that's wonderful. You know, there's an organization which is partly based in Bend called Coming to the Table. Have you heard of that one? It's an organization of Black descendants of slaves and white descendants of slave owners, which I belong to. And they have put out several books writing about the history of slavery in how it's affected different families, and do a lot of work in this area. I don't know whether they're really behind reparations or not, but it wouldn't surprise me a bit if they are. And what you're suggesting sounds like a wonderful thing to do. But you might look up Google Coming to the Table, it's called. And the director, whose name I'm embarrassed to say escapes me, lives in Bend, and a great guy. And I may remember it before the afternoon is over.
Well, thank you. I keep peppering Henry Louis Gates, who's made genealogy research so he's contributed to it becoming so popular, and he's exposed slave owners in the family history of lots of the white people whose ancestry he digs into. So I think it could be a huge movement and make a difference if more of us got on that little bandwagon.
I think so. One of the things Coming to the Table has done is to focus that so much of the financing of slavery actually was out of New England in that period. in
Mhm.
Rhode Island and Massachusetts and places like that. Well, the focus is often on the South, is where slavery was. Slavery, of course, was a national issue. It just ended up in the South. But the financing, the ships that brought slaves from Africa to North America and Central America and South America, those ships, that financing was all done out of New England for the most part.
And
Little known,
lots and lots of those northeastern states had people who had 2 or 3 slaves. My grandfather was from Pennsylvania, and he had 3
that's right.
slaves. I found
That's
in a
right.
will. So they didn't all live on plantations, but they were, enslaved people is a horrid thing.
And it's just part of how quickly people want to forget when they're embarrassed or humiliated by something that in their past they forget. And this happened in Oregon. We just, these things happened. It's not in our school books. We'll find about it, learn about it as a kid, and they don't teach courses on it anymore in school. And it disappears from history, and it shouldn't be. We should know about these things.
Anybody else have any questions?
Um,
Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say in response to Julianne and Greg's discussion about people who are literally have slave owners in their genealogy. I don't know if you've read, do you know Ta-Nehisi Coates? He's a very
Yes.
articulate, wonderful Black man, a writer. And he makes the point that whether we come from a slave owning family or not, all of us have benefited economically from slaves in this country. So we could all feel, whether we had that exact history, that in fact, just as part of the economy, we benefited from the work of slaves.
Right, except for slaves.
Another way to think about it.
Yes, no doubt about it. Yeah.
It's an argument I have with my own cousins, because they say, that's in the 1700s. What did I do? It's not my fault. And I said, wait a minute. Let's talk about the benefits that you and I have experienced in our lives. All white people have experienced in our lives.
Look
Well,
how
it's a good,
yeah.
It's a good book. I can't think of the names of Ta-Nehisi Coates' books. Can somebody?
I have it here somewhere. Let me see if I can find
Yeah,
it.
he writes for the Atlantic, but you could share those book titles with your cousins.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Vivi.
They're persuasive.
All right, any other questions?
Just one comment, picking up on the last comment about how we benefited from slavery. In this case, how we benefited from free land here in Oregon. For us, it was free. And for our ancestors, it was free, but it wasn't free to the people who had to give it up out here, the native tribes. And of course, I'm writing, I've got another book in the works on the Modoc, or an article I've written on the Modoc War in Southern Oregon and Northern California, in 1873, something like that. I can have my year off a little bit here. My memory fades as the years go by. But, the Modocs were just pushed off their land by settlers who wanted their land and forced on the reservations. And that's happened over and over again. So the land was free to whites, but, that's wonderful economically for the white folks, but not good at all for the people who lived on the land, were the native tribes, and just forced off of it. So there was another case like, with slavery, where people benefited from slavery. People benefited from the land that they basically stole, quote unquote, from native tribes.
I have a question.
Yeah, Wanda.
Have you seen, Richard, any effect of the books that you have written on the Oregon legislature or in other media that have picked up on that? The reason I'm on this history, the reason I'm asking is because sometime in the last 2 weeks, I was just going through Apple News, the Apple News feed, And there's a National Geographic article about this very topic, about sort of slavery in Oregon and the sort of hidden Oregon history. And the National Geographic article connected it to the Black Lives Matter movement, and especially in Portland, and the race of the people who were out there night after night after night protesting, which is mostly white. Okay. And then also just the sort of the whiteness of Oregon in itself, and Portland in itself. So have you seen any effect that your writings have had on this issue?
Well, I could say my nose is a little out of joint, that almost everything I read in the National Geographic article I wrote in my book, which suggested that maybe the author of the book or the author of the article had some knowledge of my book, which has been out since 2009. Has been the subject of an Oregon Public Broadcasting program, sold quite well, in Oregon, in the Northwest. And so I think it probably, I don't know whether the author of the National Geographic article knew about my book or not, but the fact that they wrote in a way like this was just discovered, this Oregon history was just discovered, did make me turn up my nose just a little bit on that. I think the book, like I said, the book has been out to 2009. We sold a lot of books. It's got into some schools and different places, got into television programs. I've done book events all over. I can't say that everybody knows about it, but it's helped to circulate the story, and I do feel in the history, and I feel good about that.
Okay, thank you.
I know I'd always heard rumors about it. I'd heard about the fact that we had an exclusion law and so forth, but never in the great detail that you have researched and written about. So I appreciate that.
Thank you, Nancy. And people did know in a vague general way about the clause in the Constitution. It was kind of hard to disguise that, but the other things were quickly forgotten about. Like, who knew there was ever a slave trial in Oregon? Whoever knew there were slaves out here? Whoever knew that it was the major issue at the Constitutional Convention? All those things kind of blew me away. As a veteran journalist, I can't say anything really surprised me, but it certainly did get my attention, because I didn't know. I was educated in Oregon schools, attended Willamette University, and knew none of this, until I came across these revelations by my grandparents. Bless them dearly for doing this.
Yeah.
Julianne? I'm confused by that. I was at the University of Oregon for the better part of the 60s. And during that time, I remember learning that for me, the fundamental issue was that when Oregon and Missouri came in, there was a rule, I don't know if it was a law or just a practice in the United States, that when two states entered the Union, one had to be slave and one had to be non-slave just to keep the balance. And that Oregon wanted to be a slave state, but Missouri was much more heavily slave bound. And so it got the slave state status, and we could only enter the Union as a non-slave state. And therefore the exclusion laws came. Now, how did I learn that in Eugene in the mid 60s? I was heavily involved in the civil rights activities then. Is that why it came up? I've been confused ever since. I thought, and of course, as soon as you pick up knowledge for yourself, you begin to think it's general knowledge. So I've been confused ever since that nobody else seemed to know that. I've known that forever, it seems. So it would be interesting to me about how come that didn't move out of Eugene during the 60s. Why didn't that information move to other campuses?
I don't know, Julianne. I've read the text of the Constitutional Convention, and that issue never came up. I mean, if there was such an understanding at the time the delegates voted on the Oregon Constitution, that never came up. And it may be that it was involved in the discussions in Washington, D.C.
It was a federal rule. It was a federal rule at the time.
Okay, I didn't know that, but I accept that was indeed the case. I do know there was supposed to be a trade-off. There was supposed to be an even number of slave and not, slave states to balance off non-slave states. I do know
That was the Missouri Compromise.
Right.
I believe that it was no longer in effect by the time Oregon became a state.
Well,
could be
Oregon
wrong.
became a state at the time that Missouri did. And I think I learned about the
Well,
Missouri Compromise in high school in Coos Bay,
Missouri
Oregon.
Compromise, I think, left us before. I could be wrong. What I did want to mention was that in light of the Asian problem, again, that's cropping up horribly, I would highly recommend Mr. Nokes' book about the massacre in Oregon of the Chinese, because we really had a history of bad treatment of Asians here too.
So thank you, Marjorie. And as I recall from the constitutional debate, the only reason that an exclusion law wasn't passed against the Chinese, or a major reason, was because people liked them as servants in their homes. A number of the delegates had them already as servants, and this was an issue for them. But there was a lot of anti-Chinese rhetoric elsewhere in the Constitution, banning them from owning property and from voting and other discriminatory actions.
Yeah.
Yes, not well treated.
The library has that book, and it also has the book you've been discussing. So in case someone wants to read it.
Well, thank you for mentioning it, Marjorie. I hope everybody wants to read it.
Yeah, I do too.
The books are also at the Cannon Beach bookstore.
Yes.
So, one other question I have for you, Greg, before we go, and that is, was the exclusionary clause in the Constitution ever really enforced? You said it was taken out of the Constitution in 1959, but how much of it was, how often and how seriously was it enforced?
I don't think that was enforced. Another earlier exclusion law was enforced against some African Americans. I don't think the clause in the Constitution was. For one reason, the Civil War was fought, and the amendments that came out of the Civil War obviously banned, the fact that Oregon's Constitution, Oregon could prevent African Americans from living here. The Civil War decided that issue. So the fact the clause continued in the Constitution really had no effect except as an embarrassment and a black mark against Oregon, in my sense. There was an earlier attempt, I think in 2001, to remove that clause, and voters rejected removing the clause, if you can believe that, even though it no longer had an effect. There was an earlier exclusion law, if I get my years right, I think in 1949 to 54, there was an exclusion law in effect, which did ban an African-American businessman, in that period quite prominently, and some others from Oregon in that period. And that was later dropped in 1854. But as I said earlier, there was in Oregon's early history, whether it was enforced or not, there were exclusion laws against African Americans from living here. And while not always enforced, the fact that it existed was a statement to the rest of the country that African Americans aren't going to be welcome here, which is indeed was the case. Would discourage a population from growing that way.
Yeah, when you think about the Vanport history during World War II, when so many Blacks came from Southern United States to work in the shipyards, the exclusionary clause, it was still there, somewhat in our country, as you say, was probably negated by the Civil War, but we still had it at that time period.
Well, it was removed in 1926, Nancy.
Okay, so we didn't.
Yeah.
Marjorie.
Yes, I graduated from Lincoln High School in downtown Portland. It's where Portland State is now, the old Lincoln. And when Vanport happened, the Blacks were parceled out all over the city at varied schools because they didn't, otherwise they would have been crowded into just one. Anyway, for the first time, there were a great many Blacks who attended Lincoln. And many of them had come from the South, but before that happened, there were Blacks who attended Lincoln whose parents had lived in downtown Portland area since the 1860s and that. And so I can vouch for the fact that at least for those people, there was not any making them leave. And some of them said that it had to do with the Dred Scott decision partially,
Yeah.
the law in Oregon. So they did not want to have to return slaves, in other words, so they don't want any Blacks in the state. But
Yeah, and you know your history, you know how uncomfortable it was for Blacks in other parts of Oregon. You know, I started my journalism career in Medford and Jackson County, where not a single Black
right.
was there. And when I was working for the Medford Mail Tribune, the editor, who was a liberal, Eric Allen Jr., bless his soul, worked with the federal government, the FAA, to bring in a Black family and to work at the airport. And they moved in, husband and wife and two children, one or two children. I've forgotten exactly how many. I can't remember how long they lasted. Maybe it was months. But when a cross was burned in their lawn, they left. And that was during my period of living in Medford for several years as a journalist. Those were the only Blacks who were there, and they were they left because of the hostility community. And
I don't know what it was like in Portland. My family came in either 1853 or 4. I can never remember what wagon train they were on. But so I'm
you know, there was an active KKK in Portland, as well as Tillamook, as well as Coos Bay.
I know the KKK. I know about the one in Portland anyway. They were against Catholics and Jews. Because at the time it was really, really active. There were hardly any Blacks.
Right. But there were also on the books sundown laws in many, many small towns in Oregon.
Oh, yes.
Sundown laws that said,
and Marjorie, there were Blacks here, not in great numbers, but there were Blacks here. And indeed, the KKK was active against Blacks as well. A cross was burned, and I think in the Pilot Butte and in Bend in that period too.
Yes, all I know about is Portland, and there it was mostly Catholics and
That's
Jews.
true. They tried to close down St. Mary's Academy as our
yes, yeah, and they took all the school books away from Catholic schools.
Yeah, I remember covering, doing stories on urban renewal in Portland, as well as the Coliseum and Emmanuel Hospital. And
yes,
I mean, there's been efforts all the way through history here.
So yeah, I don't want to say there was not Black discrimination. It's discrimination against Blacks in Portland, because it certainly was.
redlining was prominent.
Yes.
All right. Well, I
you need to know the history.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Greg, for giving us your talk. I think it was quite interesting to a lot of people. I think it's generating more discussion, which is good. And we might have you back to continue this conversation sometime.
Happy to do it, Nancy. Thank you very much for having me, and I appreciate all the questions. And
thank you.
And
thank you.
It's been great hearing you.
And we will be back next month with J.A. Jance, who on a totally different genre, mystery. And we hope that you will all join us then. So please have a good afternoon. And again, thank you, Greg. And we are done for the day.
Thank you, Nancy. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.